Not long ago, Mrs. Chambers's only son passed away. He died a hero, yet it offered no solace to a mother's grieving heart. Now, as she walked the path to her son's grave, Mrs. Chambers would ask herself the same question. Why had she agreed to have Ryan buried here in the city? It would have been better to lay him to rest in his hometown next to his father's grave, where she too would eventually rest. Time was not on her side. Mrs. Chambers knew her days were numbered. At least, that's what the sorrow-stricken mother believed. Grief had gripped her, crushing her heart, and for 40 days it had refused to loosen its hold. Yes, today marked 40 days since Ryan's passing. When it came to deciding his burial, Mrs. Chambers had agreed to his friend Gabriel's suggestion. Let Ryan rest at the city cemetery. His family was here, his wife, though they had never had children together. Chelsea, his wife, was a beautiful, intelligent woman from a wealthy family. Mrs. Chambers had believed her son and his wife were soulmates. It was only at the funeral that she realized how mistaken she had been. Chelsea, plainly disinterested at her husband's funeral, shed no tears. Were it not for her sombre attire, one might doubt she was a widow. Chelsea seemed almost bored. It was evident the ceremony was a mere inconvenience to her. She didn't even bid her husband farewell or stay for the memorial, nor did her parents. Ryan had died heroically in an explosion at his automobile workshop. He had been the first to rush to save the trapped workers inside, rescuing everyone, including 3 employees and himself. However, after inhaling toxic fumes, he succumbed in the hospital. Yes, Ryan was a hero, a title he had earned since childhood. Mrs. Chambers slowly walked along the path, reminiscing about how her son had always come to the aid of others, even as a young boy. He had a generous heart, always helping neighbours, whether fixing their cars or assisting with household repairs. Mrs. Chambers and her husband had only offered love and support to their son, often saying, "Doing good is the right path. It will always come back to you." They had anticipated he might become a doctor or pursue a career as an engineer, but Ryan opted to become a mechanic, taking a course at the local college whilst doing more practical jobs as an apprentice at a local garage. Well, it's a respectable profession, his parents had conceded, content with their son's choice. He was their late blessing, born when Mrs. Chambers was over 40, a genuine miracle. When Ryan was in his first year of college studying the trade, his father suddenly passed away. His heart just stopped. Mrs. Chambers had thought she would succumb to grief herself, but the thought of her son had kept her going. In his second year, Ryan had started working longer hours to ease his mother's burden. She had scolded him, insisting his primary focus should be on his studies, while providing for him was her responsibility. She worked as a teacher in Oakdale, a small rural town, earning modestly. But what more did she need? Everything was for her son. Nonetheless, Ryan brushed off her concerns. He couldn't bear to be a burden on his mother's shoulders. So, from his college days onward, he gradually delved into business. After excelling in his studies, he went on to open his very own garage workshop, which steadily expanded. While not a millionaire, he managed to buy a house, a car, and renovate a home for his mother in town. By then, she had retired. Then, Ryan got married. Mrs. Chambers had initial reservations about her daughter-in-law, a pampered city girl, and the daughter of a local banker. But she didn't have to live with her, and Ryan's happiness was important. Of course, Chelsea rarely interacted with her mother-in-law and never visited Oakdale. Her in-laws, too, admired their daughter's choice, believing Ryan had a knack for business and a bright future. Moreover, he adored their daughter, pampering her and fulfilling her every whim. Chelsea frequently changed expensive jewellery. indulged in upscale boutiques, and jetted off to luxurious resorts. They appeared to be the epitome of marital bliss. Hence, when tragedy struck Ryan, Mrs. Chambers couldn't fathom how swiftly his wife and her parents had moved on. Mrs. Chambers approached her son's grave, tears streaming down her cheeks. It seemed she had cried all her tears over these past 40 days, yet upon reaching her son's grave, anguish pierced her again. Tearfully, Mrs. Chambers summoned the strength to clear the wilted flowers from the grave, wipe the photograph on the cross, and replace them with fresh roses. Then, her legs buckled, and she sank onto her son's grave, weeping. It felt as though no force could lift her, no one could help her. But perhaps there is a limit to the body's capacity, even for tears. Mrs. Chambers gradually composed herself, sighing as she struggled to rise. Standing, she gazed silently at her son's photograph, then cast her eyes skyward. Yes, somewhere up there was her son. Suddenly, she heard laughter behind her, sharp and not fitting into the cemetery atmosphere. Mrs. Chambers flinched, turning to find herself face to face with Chelsea. Her former daughter-in-law stood nearby. "Hello, Chelsea," Mrs. Chambers greeted, trying to ignore the woman's icy gaze. "You're here. You remembered today marks the 40th day since Ryan's passing." "So what?" Chelsea retorted, smirking. "I'm here for other matters, merely passing through." The distraught mother was at a loss for words. Only now did she notice Chelsea wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit stood beside her, evidently amusing her with whispered remarks. A faint smile played on his lips, mirrored by Chelsea's own. And this unsightly, unbelievable scene unfolded beside her husband's grave, 40 days after he was laid to rest. "Darling, let's go," Chelsea's companion interjected. "I'll just place some flowers on my grandma's grave. It's her anniversary today." "Yes, dear," Chelsea replied, and they strolled past Ryan's grave. Mrs. Chambers stood there, overwhelmed with disgust. Chelsea had already moved on with another man, and her lover's grandmother took precedence over her own husband. "Is that his mother?" Chelsea's companion's voice reached Mrs. Chambers. "Yes, a peasant woman, much like her son," Chelsea dismissed contemptuously. "And the child, have you decided what to do with him?" the man inquired. "Yes, it's all settled. I've no use for a child from a loser." Their conversation treated Mrs. Chambers as though she were invisible. Yet the elderly woman, upon hearing mention of a child, stirred. She hastened after her former daughter-in-law, seizing her hand. "Chelsea, are you pregnant, dear? Spare no sin. It's my grandson, Ryan's only legacy," she said, anxiously studying her daughter-in-law's face. But Chelsea's features twisted into a sneer. She abruptly wrenched her hand free from Mrs. Chambers's grasp, snapping, "What child? You're delusional. Have you completely lost your mind?" "But you just mentioned," Mrs. Chambers began, bewildered. "Take my advice. Don't listen to other people's conversations," Chelsea snapped. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of something like guilt crossed her face, then vanished. "Ignorant countrywoman, do you truly believe I would bear a child from your worthless son? What need have I of that? Not only did he die, but his business went bankrupt too." "How did his business collapse? Everything seemed prosperous," Mrs. Chambers ventured. "Yes, it appeared so," Chelsea jeered, "but only for a time. Lately he plunged into huge debt. That's all. Leave me be." And with that, Chelsea, clasping her companion's hand, departed down the path. Mrs. Chambers returned to her son's grave, sinking to her knees. "Is it true, my son? I cannot comprehend," she whispered. The bereaved mother glanced upward at the pure blue sky. Beneath such a sky, one might assume there was no malevolence, pain, loss, or deception. Yet, reality dictated otherwise. Mrs. Chambers sat for an eternity, her mind blank, with just a dull ache. She failed to notice Chelsea and her companion walk by on their return. She was completely ignored by her former daughter-in-law. Nor did she register the bird song or the distant hum of the city. She was consumed by her grief. Yes, her son had been accomplished, yet in the end he would be remembered only by his mother. Regrettably, Ryan left no mark on this earth. Mrs. Chambers didn't know how long she had been there until her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her back to reality. It was Gabriel, Ryan's friend. Someone still remembered her son. She answered the call. "Hello, Mrs. Chambers. Are you at the cemetery?" inquired Gabriel. "Yes, I am," she confirmed. "Could you wait for me there? I've just finished work. We can go to a cafe and talk about Ryan." "Very well," she agreed. And an hour later, they were seated in a quaint cafe. The food sat untouched on Mrs. Chambers's plate, her chest tight with anger toward Chelsea. How could she speak of her son in such a manner, and what child was she referring to? Mrs. Chambers recounted her meeting with Chelsea to Gabriel. He listened intently, then sighed, and told her everything. Yes, Ryan encountered troubles at work in recent months. Suppliers had given them inferior parts. Then there was a significant defect, which occurred on a previously repaired car whilst being driven by the owner, and investigations ensued. Ryan was at his wits' end. His banker father-in-law could have intervened but refused. Or perhaps because Chelsea and Ryan were on the brink of divorce. For 3 months, she had been unfaithful to her husband with a young, promising son of her father's friend. "My poor son," Mrs. Chambers lamented. "Why did he not confide in me?" She hesitated to share further, her voice faltering, afraid of burdening Gabriel any further. "And the child?" she remembered. Chelsea had mentioned a child, prompting Gabriel to reveal another revelation. Ryan had longed for a child, but Chelsea was against it. She didn't want to ruin her figure. However, on the brink of their marriage breaking down, they reached a compromise. If she refused to bear a child herself, they would employ a surrogate mother. Ryan covered all expenses, and soon they found a willing young woman to carry their child. Initially, all was well, but problems arose at the shop, finances dwindled, and Chelsea started cheating on him. Ryan didn't care. He just wanted to be a father, regardless of the circumstances. "And what became of this woman?" Mrs. Chambers asked, turning pale, expecting to hear the worst. "Don't worry," Gabriel hurried to reassure her. "To my knowledge, she should still be pregnant. Unless what?" "Unless Chelsea demanded she terminate the pregnancy at any time, as per the contract. Truthfully, I assumed she had already done so. At first, I didn't interfere in the matter, and I didn't tell you anything because I thought it was only Ryan and Chelsea's business." "What a nightmare," the woman sobbed. "Gabriel, help me find her. Perhaps it's not too late. You owe Ryan that much, do you not?" "I've seen her on occasion when Ryan drove her to the clinic. I know only that she came from an orphanage. Her name is Isabella, and she already has a daughter." Gabriel thought for a moment, then nodded in agreement. "I'll find her, I promise." The following day, Gabriel was able to contact the Family Planning Centre. For a generous fee, they revealed that Chelsea had insisted the surrogate mother undergo an abortion at 6 months into the pregnancy. The centre refused her request, but promised to put the child up for adoption immediately upon birth. However, the surrogate mother vanished suddenly. She vacated her rented accommodation, her phone silent, and she was not at her home address. Chelsea cancelled the contract. Locating Isabella seemed an impossible task, but Gabriel, plagued by guilt over his departed friend, was able to do it. He called upon old contacts in law enforcement and even enlisted the aid of a private investigator. Eventually, Mrs. Chambers received the elusive address. Isabella had relocated to the suburbs, settling with a childhood friend from the orphanage. She had fled Chelsea's clutches, as what she demanded was unthinkable to Isabella. Fortunately, Chelsea made no effort to find her, deciding that cancelling the contract freed her from the obligations and from the inconvenience of an unwanted child. And so, Mrs. Chambers found herself standing before a modest, tidy home, hesitating to enter. Eventually, she unlatched the gate and crossed into the yard. The first sight to greet her was a 5-year-old girl seated beside a flower bed, etching something into the ground with a stick. "Hello, who are you looking for?" the girl inquired, curiosity gleaming in her eyes. "I believe I'm looking for your mother," the elderly woman stammered. "Just a moment," the girl nodded understandingly and darted into the house. Moments later, a tall, slender figure emerged onto the porch, bearing no sign of pregnancy. Mrs. Chambers's heart sank. Had Isabella got rid of the child after all? "Are you Isabella?" Mrs. Chambers queried, her voice trembling. "Yes," the woman said cautiously and sighed, putting down a heavy package. "Who are you, and what do you want?" "My name is Mrs. Chambers. I am Ryan's mother." "Why are you here? I have already told you that I will not get rid of the child, and it's too late anyway." Isabella's voice shook, and her lips quivered. "My dear, what are you saying? You're so smart, I'm glad you didn't listen to Chelsea," Mrs. Chambers replied, her voice trembling with nerves, barely holding back tears. "I came to tell you that you can rely on me completely. I'll help you, and if you don't want to raise this child, I'll take him," Mrs. Chambers assured her. "I won't give him to anyone," Isabella whispered quietly. "He's mine," she said, bursting into tears. Mrs. Chambers hugged her, trying to calm her down, and soon found herself in tears as well. "Oh, why are we crying here?" she suddenly realized. "Maybe we should go inside the house, although your friend doesn't look very welcoming." When she mentioned her friend who owned the house, Isabella's expression darkened. "Can I trust you?" she asked. "Completely," Mrs. Chambers assured her. "Then let's step away a bit." Isabella left the package at the gate and waddled like a duck to the bench across the road. The small girl obediently followed, and Mrs. Chambers joined them. They settled onto the bench just as Isabella's friend peeked out from her house, shot them an unkind look, retrieved the package with groceries, and disappeared back inside. "Why are you carrying such heavy loads? You're going to give birth soon," Mrs. Chambers remarked. "I have no choice," sighed Isabella. "Vivian and I grew up in the orphanage together. She was the only one who agreed to take me in, but I have to help her with everything," Isabella explained, launching into her story. After the orphanage, she trained to be a cook and worked in a small bakery. Then she fell in love with a guy, but he left her when he learned about her pregnancy. Isabella gave birth to her daughter and lived in a state-provided dorm room that was awful, with mouldy corners and a leaking ceiling. Her daughter often fell ill because of it. The doctors insisted they move, but Isabella couldn't afford it. Then she saw an ad for surrogacy. She thought it was her chance to escape poverty. Pregnancy came, and Ryan rented an apartment for her and her daughter Lily. Finally, she could live a normal life. At first, Isabella didn't think it would be so difficult, but over time, she began to understand what a trap she had fallen into. She became attached to the baby she carried more and more every day. She confessed this to Ryan, who was involved in her life, and he promised not to separate her from the child, even hinting at a relationship. He had confessed that he and his wife were getting a divorce. Then Ryan died, and Chelsea showed her true colours. Isabella overheard a conversation between Chelsea and the doctor about terminating the pregnancy or sending the baby to an orphanage. Isabella ran away from the clinic, fearing for her child's safety. She bumped into Vivian, who offered her a place to stay in exchange for work. Vivian's help came with strings attached, and Isabella felt trapped all over again. Mrs. Chambers listened intently, her heart breaking for Isabella and her daughter, who looked at her with frightened eyes. "Girls, why don't you come back with me?" Mrs. Chambers suddenly suggested. "I have a good house, a garden. The children will be happy there." "Are you serious?" Isabella whispered, confused. "I'm nobody to you, and neither is my daughter." "How can you say that?" Mrs. Chambers smiled. "You are the mother of my grandson or granddaughter. That makes you family, and Lily will be my granddaughter." On the same day, Isabella, Lily, and Mrs. Chambers left for Oakwood. Soon, Isabella's baby was born at the regional hospital, a healthy boy called Leo. The family settled into their new life together. One evening, Mrs. Chambers gazed upon her grandson, sleeping soundly in his crib, and a flicker of peace warmed her heart. "We were right, Ryan," she whispered. "Doing good does find its way back. Not in the way we imagined, perhaps, but it does. A bittersweet lesson, hard bought, but a lesson nonetheless, and one Mrs. Chambers would carry for the rest of her days alongside the enduring memory of her son,